Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session of this reading group on Catherine Malabou's Destructive Plasticity. Like the other session and the next session, this session will be divided roughly in two. So in the first half hour, I will deliver some kind of overview on the reading that I assigned for this session. In the second half, there will be some discussion or Q&A. For this session, we will move away from Hegel, but we will still be in a bit of a complicated territory because Malabou's stance on feminism, which is the topic of this session, is complex. And so there's quite a bit to unpack. Being the reading for this one session, for today's session, quite dense, so it is quite possible that you have made something quite different out of it, and your take in the second half of this session is much encouraged. So yeah, without further ado, I would like to start off by putting out there what I think is the overall assumption of Malabou's argument for the reading for this session, namely the fact that Malabou is quite sympathetic with attempts such as Irigaray's or Butler's to conceive of feminism philosophically, or to adopt a philosophical framework as the proper framework for feminism. So Malabou is very sympathetic with that, but she also adds that this needs to be taken a little further. Namely, it must be acknowledged that, again, I'm putting it quite brutally, but yeah, I think that Malabou's point is really that philosophy can only be accomplished outside of philosophy and beyond philosophy. And so this is, I think, what Malabou thinks that Butler and Irigaray have a bit overlooked. What exactly I mean with Malabou thinks that philosophy can only be accomplished beyond philosophy, although philosophy remains the main framework whereby to frame feminist issue, is something I will get to at the end of my overview, at the end of a fairly long detour. And so, yeah, let's keep this question frozen for a bit. I will get to the end of it, and I will get to it through a fairly long conceptual detour. One thing that I think needs to be introduced right away is, again, a brief summary of the first essay of the collection that this essay, the reading for this session, was taken from, namely Changer de Différence. Essentially, the philosophical premise in it is very similar, in fact, to what we have seen in the last session 2 weeks ago regarding plasticity, according to Hegel. And it is a point that she develops in greater length in another book called The Heidegger Change, Le Changement Heidegger. And again, to make a very long story very short, her point would be that just like in the case of Hegel's substance subject, there is a basic reversibility which defines plasticity between essence and accident. So accidents derives from essence, but also the other way around. The same thing is taken to apply to Heidegger ontology as well. So what she highlights, her point, again, I'm summarizing a whole book in just a few seconds, so you have to bear with me a little, is that the same reversibility applies to the ontic and the ontological. So being as mere existent without a capital B, and being with a capital B, namely the ontological principle that creates and produces difference. In other words, being, the ontological principle with a capital B, should not be meant as something which expresses the existence, but rather something which transforms the nothingness that it is into something, and that something is the ontic thing, the existent. So, in other words, the relationship between ontic and the ontological is not predicative in a narrow sense, but rather it's one of speculative change, namely that the unattainable being transforms itself into the ontic pretty much in the same way that the substance would uh, self-deny in order to enter into the accidents, as we have seen the other as we have seen 2 weeks ago. And why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because in this essay, in this first essay of the collection from which I have taken the reading for this session, in this essay, she deals with part of Luce Irigarai's thought, and particularly the part that owes the most to this Heideggerian strand. So much so that she establishes a comparison between Irigaray and Levinas, no less, um, based on the distinction that Irigaray makes between the feminine and woman, as in the feminine as a quasi ontological principle of production of difference, a kind of opening that produces difference, and woman as the ontic existing woman and women. What Malabou has to say about it is that, I mean, she doesn't have any particular objections to it, but she notices that the features that Irigaray ultimately associates with the feminine, with this opening that producing, this ontological opening that produces the ontic, that makes the ontic derive. So the features that are associated to this principle end up to be recognizably feminine after all. So this opening has features such as the maternal domesticity, hospitality, and so on. And in fact, in the same essay, she says that similar features apply also to the kind of opening that is assumed by Levinas as producing the existence. So again, without having particular objections against this argument, Malabou notices that after all, on top of their distinctions, the feminine and woman, the ontological, the quasi-ontological dimension, and the ontic dimension, namely concrete existing women, are not so different after all. There is a convergence between the ontological and the ontic, which is again is something that Malabou buys completely into, given the premises with which I have started my overview, namely the reversibility between ontic and ontological, which Malabou qualifies as plastic in the case of Heidegger too. So this convergence between ontological and ontic, the feminine as ontological principle and woman, must properly be thought through, which is something that Irigaray started to do without, however, pushing this to the extreme consequences, which is essentially what the essay that was associated to this one session was about. This reading, the reading for this session, was about thinking through this convergence between ontic and ontological, or essence and accident, as the proper philosophical framework for feminist issues. What distinguishes Malabou from a lot of other feminist stances, which is something that comes across very clearly in this reading, is that precisely because of this reversibility between essence and accidents, the ontological and the ontic, Malabou does not at all discards essence. So, in other words, she does see the perils of essentialism, and she rejects essentialism, but she doesn't reject essence as a philosophical tool. More precisely, she tries to discard both essentialism and anti-essentialism, claiming that in fact the very division between essentialism and anti-essentialism is fully within the phallo-logocentric horizon. And she says that because she stresses the fact that according to even very traditional definitions of essence, like for instance, again, Hegel, essence has really nothing to do with things like stability, self-presence, or say nature and the like. Rather, essence is about transformation. And as such, is something that is fully viable also as a framework for feminism. And so nothing could be farther from Malabou's attitude than a presupposition that essence and identity are masculine constructs and the feminine opposite would be all about difference. Malabou does not at all opposes essence and difference in the or identity and difference in this, or essence and accidents in this way, but rather she tries to keep them connected and speculatively connected. And this is important because most of the argument in this reading is about denying the denial of essence to the feminine, to woman. She does not agree with stances like, for instance, the deconstructionist stances, which reject any essence altogether for the feminine, for woman. And she says that it is important that if we do not acknowledge an essence to the feminine, an essence to women, we are not able to properly take stock of the violence inflicted systemically to women. To deny an essence to the feminine, to deny an essence to women, means to perpetrate at the symbolic level the violence which at the systemic level is done to women regularly. And again, when she argues for this, Malabou clings to the presupposition that the essence of the feminine is strictly of a philosophical kind. Namely, the essence of the feminine turns out to be very similar to the ontological principle of the feminine, which in turn cannot be separated from the ontic womanly, let's say. Which is to say that the essence of the feminine needs to be regarded as a kind of nothingness that is not nothing, namely a kind of nothingness that only becomes a presence through the violence systemically inflicted to her. And so it's something that exists reactively in a sense. And to deny this particular status of existence to the feminine, to the womanly, means to deny the violence inflicted to her. And so it is mandatory, according to Malabou, to think through the philosophical status of the essence of women in these terms, in these paradoxical terms of something that is not something if not through the violence that is done to it. So it's not something like the inviolable in Levinasian terms, but rather something like the non-violable, namely something that only comes to existence through that kind of negativity. Or another way to define it in Malabou's text is ontological amputation, which is a cursory formula that kind of renders the idea. So, again, it is important to stress the strictly philosophical terms that the essence of the feminine can be defined according to Malabou. And through these philosophical terms, it is possible to eschew the trap, according to Malabou, of a frontal opposition between essentialism and anti-essentialism, which, according to her, is misleading. It's a third way that needs to be found, and that ultimately, according to her, Butler and Irigaray stop short of finding, because both Butler and Irigaray kind of remain this side of Western metaphysics. Essentially, they remain kind of too attached, if only negatively, to a principle of unattainable, to a presupposition of an unattainable origin, which, according to Malabou, is a mimetic principle. This is something that in the reading is insisted upon quite frequently. Plasticity is not mimicry. A lot of parts of Butler and Irigaray are still too attached to the, after all, the constructionist principle of mimicry, and this is, according to Malabou, not enough. One example, for instance, is Butler's claim: there is no body that isn't travestied, that isn't disguised. There is no original body that isn't already a disguise, that isn't already in disguise. So even a naked, untouched body is already a disguise of itself. That owes too much, according to Malabou, to an assumption of coming to the fore by imitating what cannot be imitated, by trying to reproduce an origin that cannot be reproduced. So this kind of negative presupposition of an origin that cannot be attained is something that ultimately make Butler and Irigaray stop short of their own premises, and that applies to Irigaray too, as also discussed in the reading. What Malabou contests Irigaray is the reluctance to find a definite definition or a definite essence to woman, for the same reasons, and this objection ultimately has the same reasons behind, the same rationale behind the objections that Malabou puts forward to Butler. So it's this kind of mimetic dimension that the implicit mimetic dimension that Malabou does not quite buy into. So what she proposes instead, what she puts forward instead, it's some kind of in a way positive point of clinging for an essence of the feminine to be defined. And what she proposes as an essence, although she doesn't quite spell it out in this way in the reading, I think it is inevitable to draw this conclusion in particular. What she puts forward as a possible definition of woman is the empty intersection between the cultural and the biological, or between the symbolic and the biological. What do I mean by that? Again, in terms that are pretty much the same of Butler and Irigaray, every sexis, every identity constitutes itself through some kind of loop between the cultural and the biological, through some kind of self-transformation of the biological into the biological through the cultural, and the other way around, in such a way that neither of the two, neither the symbolic nor the biological, neither the cultural nor the biological, can be taken as original, as the one that the other roots itself into. So, and this kind of process is one through which every sexual identity becomes itself, but only in the feminine, immediately embodied philosophical version of this principle. So what distinguishes the feminine from the other identities, although ultimately the feminine is just one of the many possible sexual identities, is the fact that it immediately embodies the philosophical paradox of this closed circuit between the symbolic and the biological. So it embodies the non-predicability of the articulation between the cultural and the biological, whose originless intersection underlies actually all of the other identities, all of the other genres. And so, in other words, it is this philosophical essence that distinguishes the feminine, the woman, from the others, from the other identities and from the other sexes. Although again, it is at another level, on the same level with the others. Taking this principle in the wrong way, not acknowledging this principle for what it is, leads to violence, which in this case means to take this empty intersection as the basis for the violence done to women, of implying an obligation for them to perform both in the house and in the professional field, which is something, again, that is mentioned clearly in this reading, and whose roots is the lack of, or is the failure to acknowledging for what it is, this essence of the women as the kind of immediately philosophical embodiment of this intersection between the cultural and the biological, which in fact underlies all, sex is all. In standard psychoanalytic terms, this intersection, the intersection between the cultural and the biologic, the symbolic and the biologic, is what the phallus is about. So the whole point is that the essence of the feminine would be something like a desubstantialized phallus, or a non-full phallus, also not an absent phallus, but a kind of phallus that defies the very distinction between absence and presence. But we'll get to that also later. For Malabou, crucially, this empty intersection between the symbolic and the biological, between the cultural and the biological, is literally what neurobiology is about. Neurobiology, the compound between the body and the brain, so the body as brain and the brain as body, is a, let's say, non-phallic point of empty, non-predicable intersection between the cultural and the biological. It is literally where cultural and biology meets, and they become indistinguishable, but indistinguishable in a way that defies and challenges the kind of articulation / subordination which the phallus is about, like the phallus being about this a particular and different kind of articulation between the symbolic and the biological, which are immediately intertwined in this way, which immediately intertwined according to this other perspective that Malabou puts forward. And this is, according to Malabou, what Butler and Irigaray miss. Although for pretty much everything else, she agrees with Butler and Irigaray. She says that they remain too philosophical, in a sense. They cling too much to the negative presupposition of an origin in order to explain the original co-implication of the cultural and the biological. Whereas there is a positive way to pin that co-implication down, and that way is to point at neurobiology, to point at the body-brain compound, body as brain and brain as body, as the actual realized intersection between, or immediate coincidence, immediate co-implication between these two dimensions. The feminine being, again, the philosophical embodiment of this very co-implication. So this explains also why the reading for this week was called The Possibility of Woman and the Impossibility of Philosophy. The possibility of woman is woman must acknowledge as having an essence, and this essence is philosophical, but precisely because it is philosophical, philosophy is not the ultimate framework whereby to frame it, because ultimately philosophy can only find an accomplishment beyond philosophy. Why is that so? Essentially because the ontic and ontological reverse continuously into one another, are reversible, and hence the, let's say, science of being, which philosophy is, can only find itself outside of the ontological framework into the ontic. And this is why Malabou finds philosophy, finds the extreme point of philosophy in neurobiology. Another thing that she puts forward along the same lines is when she claims in the reading at some point that Dance, for instance, has examples of a female tradition that was born at some point with, say, Pina Bausch. Literature has a female tradition that was born at some point with Marguerite Duras. Philosophy, in other words, doesn't have a female tradition that has been established and to cling to. And the reason for that is, again, paradoxically, that it is the feminine itself that is inherently too philosophical for philosophy to actually grasp it. The only way would be to go toward the natural continuation of philosophy, which, according to Malabou, is neurobiology. And in this, it is important to stress that she doesn't frame, in this case, Bausch and Duras as having occupied the, let's say, difference slot within a scheme, within a discipline that would remain essentially masculine. So it's not that they embody the feminine difference within an essentially masculine tradition like the literary tradition and the dance tradition. But she stresses instead that they both created another tradition altogether. So they have transformed the essence into another essence, as opposed to having simply occupied the slot of difference in relation to an essence which remained masculine. Which again confirms all that we have said so far regarding the non-rejection by Malabou of the essence. Quite on the contrary. So in the reading for this session, there are quite a few pages in which Malabou brings up her own individual personal case. There are reasons for that I cannot go into in a lot of detail. But yeah, it is important to remind that, namely that a lot of the reading for this session is based on Malabou's personal experience of paralleling her own becoming philosopher and becoming woman. She says that at some point in the reading, that for her to have become a philosopher and to have become a woman was essentially the same thing, in that in both cases it was a matter of affirming the feminine as the intersection, the feminine on the one hand as the intersection, the empty, non-predicable intersection between the cultural and the biological, the symbolic and the biological, and on the other hand, this as, in a way, the telos of philosophy, the most philosophical thing possible. And so quite literally, there is an inextricability in her own personal experience as she describes it, between becoming philosopher and becoming woman, as two different ways of affirming the same thing, namely that kind of intersection between the cultural and the biological, which essentially is what neurobiology is about. The trace, Derrida's trace, as in some kind of science of something which challenges the very distinction between presence and absence, which turns out having a body, as it were, or the body of trace and the trace of the body. She mentions quite at some length also Gradiva, Freud's Gradiva, as perhaps the origin of all of the hypotheses of identifying the feminine with trace in pretty much the specific sense of Derrida. What she adds to this is that the woman, the feminine, is the trace as body, the trace with a body, the trace, the trace not without a bodily dimension. This essentially comes down to the body-brain compound, body as brain and brain as body, as being an immediately transformative principle, in the sense that this compound is what transforms itself into itself, and what underlies the constitution of the various sexes, of the various sexes' identity, through itself. Through itself in this case means that this self-transformative principle is immediately present in the body, especially in the connections with the brain, and hence does not need mediations through which it works. By mediation here, I mean something very specific, which is very important in Malabou's accounts of neurobiology, as we will see in the next couple of sessions more specifically. And that mediation is sexuality. In other words, what she says is that the cultural and the biology, in order to come across as actually indistinguishable or co-implicated tightly, don't need the mediation of sexuality. Or in other words, the mediation of sexuality to tie together the cultural and biological is one among the many possible others. It has an ontic status, as it were, not an ontological one. It is a contingent mediation for an original co-implications that doesn't essentially need any complication, any co-implication between the two, because they are already co-implicated through an empty intersection, an empty non-predictable intersection. So a kind of intersection that is also different from the phallic intersection, which subordinate one to the other, which cannot prescind, which cannot do without a relationship of subordination between these two dimensions. Important feature, namely that Malabou's stance on feminism is one in which sexuality is not in the foreground, essentially, which is not the case for every stance on feminism, or which makes it an idiosyncratic take on feminism at quite a few levels. So yeah, and we will see this downplaying of sexuality also when we will tackle neurobiology more closely in the next few sessions.
Hi, Marco. I don't think she's radical enough when she produces this kind of thought, because at the end of the day, she's making this kind of philosophical thinking through a male perspective on what is to be a philosopher, or what does the philosopher do. And I don't know if this makes sense to you. How do you respond to this kind of perspective of my reading of the text?
At least not in relation to, for instance, Butler or Igaray. What she proposes is a tiny displacement of perspective vis-a-vis what they have said. So it's not something essentially different. It's just some kind of further step beyond that they haven't taken, and that she invites that perspective to take. And that would be not exactly replacing, but complementing philosophy with neurobiology in a way that is neither masculine or feminine. What she implies is that to remain a philosopher would be something like mimicking a posture that has already been masculine and in some way can only be masculine. And the only way out of this vicious circle would be to break the borders of philosophy altogether. And in that way, it wouldn't necessarily be a feminine, and in that regard, it would be a new feminine tradition in philosophy, the one that ties philosophy with neurobiology in such a way that neurobiology itself wouldn't be regarded as neither masculine nor feminine. But this very gesture would be the inauguration of a properly feminine philosophical tradition, which is the one that is missing. Or in other words, the one that is missing is one that breaks the very border itself between philosophy and what lies beyond philosophy, while continuing the premises of philosophy.
When I was reading her text, I was thinking about Michel Leduff, which is also who is also French female philosopher, and her perspective on that subject is for me easier to understand, because what Michel Duff says is that you can be a woman philosopher, but you just do philosopher a different way. It's not, and what Malabou is saying is that when you're doing, when you're being or becoming or defining yourself as a woman philosopher, you're doing something else, not philosophy.
Yeah.
That's it. Am I following?
Yeah. And
Okay.
it's the same thing that she says also regarding the other two examples that she makes in passing in just one paragraph, like the ones that are mentioned, literature and dance. With Duras and Bausch, another literature begins and another dance begins, which of course is not without relationship with the other ones, but it's something else. And yeah, so yeah, I mean, if this is not being radical enough, then yes, then Malabou is not radical enough, in the sense that this is indeed what she does, namely not to do philosophy in a different way, but to do another philosophy.
There was a passage I found extremely hard to decipher on the beginning of page 111. Malabou says, and I quote, "The ideology at work in concepts does not come from the concepts themselves, but from the metamorphosis of their pragmatic and motor value as noems." I was wondering if you can help me decipher this passage.
Motor schemes are essentially the ones that we have quickly seen last time, as in, what was it, the salamander and the spider and the phoenix. So the motor scheme here refers particularly to writing and to let's say the origins that writing are looking toward or looking to, or the kind of the origins that are presupposed in the concept and that a concept goes to, is not necessarily only the kind of origin that writing presupposes in a, again, deconstructive sense. The book in which she discusses the motor schemes thing is, I think, Plasticity at the Dusk of Writing, which is the one in which she claims that the trace needs to be sided with another thing, which is the form. So in other words, by motor schemes here, she implies that we don't have to think of writing as the only possible motor schemes underlying concepts, but rather we should look at writing as supplemented by form. Which in this case means, let me get back to that page 111. Yeah, so essentially what she means is that the ideology at work in concepts must be retraced according to an origin to be conceived as both trace and form, in terms of form as much as in terms of trace. And so both have to be taken into account, which I think, let me take a look also at the following sentence to double check whether this flows better in this way. As motor schemes concepts are originally precipitates or beginnings of actual accelerators that allow us to advance the equivalence of reason for thoughts. Before concepts become fixed as noemes, we must find a way of creating a trans-philosophical space, one on which women are allowed to transform their impossibility of being into a specific power. I think it can be translated as follows. We have to look for a form which informs a concept along with the trace that it forms. We must look toward a form which allows women to transform their impossibility of being into a specific power. In other words, we have to reframe concepts in such a way that they open up the space of action for women. And this can be done only if we think in terms of form along with in terms of trace.
It is almost like she defines that women in a way are like kind of like inhabiting spaces that are like patriarchal, meaning like the change or the transformation hasn't happened. As for example, in the sense of Bauch, I'm a former professional dancer, so I'm very, very used to Bauch.
she basically inherently, like, her dance is very visceral and very feminine from the get going. Like, it is like, as you're saying, form and kind of like the body and the brain are together, kind of like rethinking or using or like questioning cultural moments, and from there creating like a construction, an authentic construction of women in the present moment, in that moment, that it might transform and change with time, but in that present moment. Whereas like other things as philosophy is like women trying, like women inhabiting spaces of men, but not completely like transforming it.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Yeah, and in other words, this would the other way to put it would be, whereas a kind of feminism has situated itself in relation to a masculine tradition, the in relation to should be taken off, as it were. And this taking off of the in relation to is in turn inseparable from the taking away of the phallic mediation between the cultural and the biological. So this kind of doing away with the necessity of finding one's identity in relation to the masculine is one and the same thing with doing away with the phallic mediation, which articulates together two dimensions like the cultural and the biological that cannot not be articulated. And so they have ways of not being not articulated anyway, which renders the phallic mediation inessential. And so there are these two things that need to be thought of as coinciding. And again, both Bausch and Duras can be taken as quite readily exemplifying this embodying the relationship between the cultural and the biological in a different way, in a way that is not literally phallic, as it were.
It's very interesting because she is a philosopher, and then she goes to science to in a certain way think about what it is to be a woman. And then when you get like a philosopher of science as Isabelle Stanger, she goes to witchcraft to try to understand other possibilities of production.
I think she mentions witchcraft at some point, but I don't remember where. That might be perhaps. I mean, I should double check, but I think that some mentions are made in the other book that she dedicated to feminism, namely the book that she dedicated to the clitoris as the alternative to the phallus. So my last answer can connect smoothly to this one, insofar as the point of what she's putting forward being some kind of alternative to the phallus quite literally means that the clitoris is elected as some kind of alternative to it, which is of course is not new. Like in this book, she goes over the various steps in the previous female philosophers like Beauvoir, Irigaray, Lonzi, and so on and so forth, which have dealt with the clitoris specifically as an alternative to the phallus. And yeah, what it gets to is this kind of elaboration of an alternative to the sheer alternative between presence and absence, which according to her also underlies claims like Lacan's claim that woman does not exist. And again, it's not that she's completely against it, but it's all a matter of like a specific meaning given to what to this she doesn't exist. So this not existing challenges the very alternative between absence and presence, as opposed to just being some kind of the opposite of presence. And of course, when it comes to Lacan, the core of the disagreement is on language, as in there is some kind of primacy to language that she contests on the basis of, again, the co-implication between the symbolic and the biological. What needs to be thought is, not language as something original, the kind of original Big Bang, but rather the very co-implication between between biology and the symbolic as the Big Bang.
I think for Lacan, the most powerful way that we can understand language is exactly with science, with all the scientific procedures. And that's why I find it a little bit like paradoxical that she goes to science specifically to think about something that will be outside of the phallic realm.
She goes to neurobiology, which is not exactly 100% coincident with going to science. So she goes to a specific branch of it, and so yeah, in this I would see something like a non-perfect coincidence between the two attitudes. But again, in this case too, I would say it's a matter of very slight shifts as opposed to stern oppositions, in the sense that, as it was the case for Butler and Irigaray too.
There's some kind of like accelerationism on science, so it becomes something else with philosophy, maybe, I don't know.
I'm not sure that I get the accelerationism part.
It is because you are studying the brain that you can rethink the whole body. Instead of going from the body to the brain, a little bit more of Freudian way of thinking it. I think she does. It should be like accelerate all the studies on the brain so you can make a reconfiguration of it all. So in a way, it's a
Yeah, it's something like studying the brain as already body. Studying the brain as a body that is also not body, as it were. Not body as in symbolic. So studying that as the threshold point between the two dimensions. So yeah. So so perhaps accelerationism in the sense that it's the point in which the very premises of dividing one field from the other collapse. So yeah, see you then. Thank you all for participating, and see you in a couple of weeks then. Thank you.